To be here with you this evening, see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. I am honored to have been invited to moderate this discussion, and I wonder what journalist wouldn't be thrilled to have a chance to sit and pick the brains of Dr. Richard Bulliet and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. I think this is a rather appropriate room for us to be in to discuss misreading history. Altschul in German or Yiddish means old synagogue. And a synagogue is a place for worship, for wrestling with the soul, and for becoming educated. And I look forward to doing that with you and our guests this evening. Now, in my time at Columbia University, where I studied at the journalism school, I did not have a chance either to study with or interview Dr. Richard Bulliet. So I'm going to make up for some of that lost time tonight. I can say this, that for the past 30-some years, he has taught in Columbia University's history department. Almost nonstop since '84, he's been director of the Middle East Institute here at Columbia University. His geographical expertise of what we call the Middle East goes from North Africa into Southwest Asia, Southern Europe, and of course over to Iran. His spiritual expertise extends through the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, although I don't quite know to which one he ascribes yet. He is a time traveler. His expertise is also in medieval studies, so from the Middle Ages to today. Dr. Bulliet is also a novelist, and I'm intending to read some of those books. His critically acclaimed nonfiction book I present to you here, The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. Well, this is Islamo-Christian civilization. And he argues that civilizations of the Middle East and the West should be viewed as sharing common cultural traditions. And I see that as a rather daring and counter-establishment, counter-culture type of view and thesis, and I'll bet that you've got some stories to tell about how people reacted to this outlandish notion of an Islamo-Christian civilization. And I hope we'll hear some of those tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Richard Bulliet.
Well, thank you very much. It's a particular pleasure to be able to share a platform with Sheikh Hamza and to see this auditorium filled more than I think I've ever seen it before. I feel like I'm opening for the Rolling Stones or something. But in fact, this is a conversation. And the format is that we will begin the conversation with two, hopefully not too long-winded monologues. And then we'll move on to having a more formal conversation. So I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes. Misreading history is not the right title. You can't misread history until it's miswritten. And I think that the crucial thing here is the miswriting of history. Now, I say you can't misread it because where do you get your history? You get your history ultimately from written sources. You may get it at first hand, or you may hear stories from your parents or friends, something like that. But at some point, somebody wrote down the history. And history is structured according to master narratives. Master narratives are those things about history that have been repeated so often and so confidently, with so little variation, that they are taken to be true. And yet none of them are. Master narratives are the triumph of the historian. Everybody would like to invent the particular story that then gets told in every history book for the next 5,000 years. But the fact of the matter is that master narratives are invented by historians, and the more successful they are, the less people are inclined to question them. And yet they're continually being questioned. And they're being questioned in ways that are effective. So that, if I can give a very obvious example, if you read a history of Europe written before, let us say, 1950, you'll read the standard history of Europe minus the women. There were no women in Europe before 1950. Then you move along, and you get a generation of really formidably talented feminist scholars who are historians. They find the sources, they read the sources, they write the stories, they publish the stories. You cannot read a history of Europe now that is not teeming with women. We need this in the Middle East, frankly. But the fact of the matter is, someone has to do it. So we have rewritten the master narratives. So European history is now coeducational. European history is, I mean. History of my hometown, Rockford, Illinois, where I grew up in a Methodist household, just to set your mind at ease. In my hometown, I grew up, and I knew that there were two people who founded Rockford, Illinois. One was named Kent, and one was named Blake. I recently went to the homepage of my town, and I found out that three people founded Rockford: Kent, Blake, and the slave of one of them. And suddenly, black people appeared because that's a new master narrative. At one time, there were no black people in American history. Now there are. So when I talk about the idea of reshaping master narratives, I'm not talking about something that's purely fanciful. I'm talking about something that is the bread and butter of what historians strive to do. And right now, there is a contest going on, to some degree, in the question of rewriting the master narratives of a history that engages the Muslim Middle East and North Africa, if not the entire Islamic world, and Europe, primarily Northwestern Europe. In that contest, on the one hand, you have a book like this bad book, just published by Anthony Pagden of UCLA, your USC, UCLA. It's called Worlds at War: The 2,500-year struggle between East and West. There's a book that the noted but not very good historian Ephraim Karsh describes as, if you are going to read only one book on the Manichaean struggle between East and West, this is the book. But that's the master narrative. It is to say not that there is a history of Europe, of Christendom, and there's a history of Islam, but rather there's a history of good and evil. And, don't be surprised if I tell you that the good happens to be the Christians and the tradition that they established in Europe, and the evil, the Manichaean. I mean, the whole note, and I wouldn't have quoted Karsh using the word Manichaean because I don't think he's a very good historian, but in fact, Pagden himself describes Islam as a Manichaean religion. He doesn't explain what he means. This is part of his singular style. But the fact of the matter is, what he talks about, he says that his book had the genesis because he has a wife who's a classicist, and she saw a picture of Iranians bowing down in prayer. And it brought back to mind the fact that Herodotus had commented that the Iranians bow down before the king. She didn't seem to be able to distinguish between God and the Persian king. And she said, here we have something that's been continuous since the days of Herodotus, namely the bowing down. And she said to her husband, why don't you write a book about the perpetual enmity between Europe and Asia? Puts the words perpetual enmity in quotes. Specifically, Herodotus's idea of the perpetual enmity between Europe and Asia. What Herodotus meant was the Trojan War. You had Athens, or the Achaeans in general, and right across the Aegean Sea, you had Troy. Troy was in Asia. The Achaeans were in Europe. That was the perpetual enmity he was talking about. But somehow it's now transformed into Herodotus, the time traveler, who can coin a phrase that will be true for the succeeding 2,500 years, which he did not live to see. This is the sort of effort to recalibrate master narratives. So what this book is, it's not a history of worlds at war. It's a history of the European imagining of its enemies. There's nothing here actually about the other side. And in fact, the author and the publisher both felt that it was unnecessary to have anyone proofread the book who actually knew any Middle Eastern languages. So he has this, every tiny Dutch village name is correctly spelled, and he has a real tough time with virtually any name from the Middle East. But the point of the matter is, it's taking the broad narrative of European history and recasting it as one of perpetual war with the East. Now we saw, this is not a big surprise. Edward Said, my admired colleague here at Columbia, wrote about this, but he wrote about it in the context of imperialism, in which you either had people who were acting as agents of imperialism or who were unconsciously abetting imperialism. But here you have something, I think, that is somewhat more tenacious. In other words, what this book tries to do is to say that everything in the European tradition has always been and forever will be good. And everything in the East, whether it's the ancient Persian Empire or the Muslims of today, will be bad. This happens to be one of the better books. I mean, it's a good read, piece of crap, but it's a good read in terms of style. And it's been well reviewed in the New York Times, in the New Yorker. It will get a bad review in the Washington Post if they publish my review. But I'm waiting to see whether they actually publish it. Now I'm going to contrast this with another effort to recast master narratives, which is my own book, Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization. The argument of that book is that, we don't have two civilizations clashing. We actually have one civilization arising ideologically and religiously out of the Abrahamic tradition, but also sharing enormous similarities and parallels over the last 14 centuries. And it could and it should be written as a single history. And that was my master narrative, and I call it Islamo-Christian Civilization. Nobody would review that book. It wasn't reviewed by any newspaper in the United States. It's been translated into other languages. It always gets reviewed outside the United States. But in this country, it was not reviewed. There were reasons for this. One of them was that it struck me that there is nothing absolutely anathema about people engaged in democratic or electoral politics taking their religion as a guide in those politics. Within the secular establishment in this country, there is a self-deluded belief that religion plays no role whatsoever in the American democracy, even at the same time they know that religion plays a powerful role in American democracy. But the idea that somebody would say it's okay for a person of faith to also be engaged in the political arena with their faith relevant to their politics, that was something that was considered unacceptable. And of course, the other thing was that Islamo-Christian civilization does not include Islamo-Christian Judeo-civilization. And I actually wait, I think, all the way to page 2 before explaining why I don't include Jewish civilization in this, because I'm not talking about the shared scriptural bases, in which, of course, I would have included Judaism, but rather I'm talking about other aspects of history, largely having to do with institutions, with interrelationships, with the issues of cohabitation or non-cohabitation, and so forth and so on. Now, a book like that, instead of taking the existing master narrative and tweaking it in a post-9/11 Manichaean direction, proposes a different master narrative in which we say, why don't we look at all this together? Now, what would happen if you did that? And is it really ridiculous, the way so many of my detractors seem to think? Well, in the first place, if you read the history, the master narratives of the history of the West, the Middle East is all over it. You know, after all, Jesus came from the Middle East. The whole religious tradition of the West comes from the Middle East. I mean, so many ways. Greeks and Romans, yes, but also Mesopotamians and Egyptians. So how is that handled by historians? Well, one thing they could do, of course, is to say, well, you could divide the Mediterranean Sea with a vertical line in which you would have, to the east of the line, all the text would be in Greek, and to the west of the line, the text would be in Latin. Then you could say you have two civilizations, and they're clashing. You have the Latin civilization versus the Greek civilization, and you could show that the Latin civilization regularly and successfully beat up the Greek civilization, because the Romans conquered everybody. But they didn't successfully impose their language. Greek continued to be the intellectual language in the East. But nobody draws that vertical line, even though everyone recognizes it. Why don't they draw the vertical line? It's because they say, we're talking about Greco-Roman antiquity. And so you hyphenate something, and you say, okay, if you put that hyphen in there, hey, it makes it all one. And so Greco-Roman antiquity it is until the Arab conquest. Then suddenly there's a horizontal line that divides the north side of the Mediterranean from southern Spain and Sicily and the south side of the Mediterranean. And that line is considered to be definitive. And yet it is no more definitive than the hypothetical vertical line that would divide the Greeks from the Latins. What do I mean by no more definitive? Well, first, I mean that most of the people on the south side of that line, most of the people living in the early caliphate were Christians. The majority of all the Christians alive at the time of the Prophet's death ended up under Muslim rule. And over a period of 300 to 400 years, their descendants, for the most part, became Muslims. Now, it's understandable that Christians at the time viewed this as an absolute catastrophe because their faith communities were taken over by someone else. And some of them became isolated, like the Armenians or the Georgians or the Ethiopians. Others became an embattled remnant, such as the remaining parts of the Byzantine Empire. Others embarked on a huge new campaign to Christianize parts of Europe that had not previously been Christian, namely Germany, Scandinavia, Poland, British Isles, etc. Islam and Latin Christendom expand at the same time. Now, it's true, Christianity is 6 centuries older, but in their particular territories are expanding at the same time, and the reason for the institutional similarities between them is that they share this great experience of having massive populations over several centuries join the new religion, whether it's Latin Catholic Christianity or whether it's Islam. So they have a shared history of expansion. But in Europe, the expansion is at the expense of polytheists. In the Middle East, it's at the expense of Jews and Christians. And in fact, you have a much more peaceful expansion of Islam than you have of Christianity. Although now the opposing master narrative argues that Islam has always been militant and violent and warlike, where you don't want to go back to early Christian history in the West and ask who was being militant and violent and warlike. And for that matter, there is no part of the world, bar none, that has as intense a history of almost continual warfare as Europe. from the time of the Peace of Augustus in the 1st century AD down to the current EU era in European history. In between, there's almost 2,000 years of nearly constant warfare. By comparison, the Islamic world is a haven of peace most of the time. But nobody wants to hear that. That's not part of the master narrative, because the master narrative is that, war and competition makes you strong and inventive and, gives you the power to rule the world. Well, this is kind of gilding the lily, I think, but it's part of this story. Now, what I'm trying to argue for is a view of history that says, the similarities, both in doctrine and in scriptural origin, and in the actual history of institutions, whether we're talking about universities or the clergy or other phenomena, the spread of a single dominant religious language, that the similarities between what happens in the Islamic Middle East and North Africa and what happens particularly in that part of Europe that becomes part of Latin Christendom, those similarities are so great as to constitute a single history. And they should be taught together. Just as someone in a classics department is expected to know Greek and Latin, and someone, at least in this university, who studies East Asian history is required to know both Japanese and Chinese, we should make it a requirement that anyone who does, let's say, pre-modern history dealing with the northwest quadrant of the Afro-Eurasian landmass, they should all be required to know both Arabic and Latin, and preferably Greek and Persian as well. Because we've been so governed by the narratives of division that we have structured our entire academy around this. It is naive, I think, of me to think this could ever change. When I was writing the book, I had this idea that I would throw out the term Islamo-Christian civilization, and then I would simply Google it every few weeks or few hours and watch as it took over the world. Because surely that is what a better idea does. This is what the better mousetrap does. So I did, and lo and behold, pretty soon I was out of the single digits. So, I can't say that my endeavor has been crowned with success, or perhaps ever will be crowned with success. But if one thing I think it has done is to introduce at least the possibility of people reading history differently. And it isn't that you can look at it this way and learn from the other. The notion of the other in itself is a questionable issue. Are we not the same? Who's the other? After all, for a very, very long time, Europeans knew perfectly well who the other was. And if you were a Lutheran, it meant it was the satanic Pope in Rome. And if you were a Catholic, it meant you were one of these, it was these people who followed these demonic, demented Protestant leaders. And then it all kind of cooled out, and they said, hey, we're all Christians. We can get along. Well, I'm not saying that there is no violence now, that there is no contest, but in the long run, we have one history. We're all sharers in this history, and if the Protestants and the Catholics can sit down and break bread together and agree to hate Muslims, then why can't the Protestants and the Catholics and the Orthodox and the Jews and the Muslims sit down and recognize that they have more to learn and more to gain from talking about their shared history than they have in allowing anyone to perpetuate the kind of ideologically distorted history that this book represents, which to me is a profound Misreading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bulliet. I think we can all make a difference in creating Islamo-Christian as a part of our current lexicon. We should go to Google, we should write about it, we should demand it, we need to put it in our language. What do you say? Why not? Because, you know, it wasn't that long ago that the notion Judeo-Christian became part of our lexicon. So there's nothing impossible, I think, about what Dr. Bulliet suggests. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who is also a teacher, who is a leader and a friend. He is founder and resident scholar of Zaytuna Institute. He is a man who has learned his religion and taught it with authenticity and love in a way that I greatly admire. I will say that he's mastered the language of the Quran, and my father is an Arab, and I've never mastered that, so I'm humbled. Zaytuna is based in Berkeley, a city that cultivates many revolutionary ideas in this last century in America. And I think a seminary, Muslim seminary, is indeed a revolutionary idea. At Zaytuna, Sheikh Hamza and his partner Imam Zaid Sheikh bring a multidimensional and pluralistic and traditional kind of learning to the spirit of Islam, and are beginning to infuse a real sturdy, steady, integral sense of Islam in America. It's a very exciting time, I believe, to be a Muslim here in this country. Sheikh Hamza is committed to, as Dr. Bulliet is, a better understanding of Islam in this country at this time of crossroad. And indeed, we are at a crossroads here in this country, and I think globally. Since the defining day of that crossroad, September 11th, 2001, Hamza Yusuf has emerged as an expert on Islam in America. Like Professor Bulliet, he emphasizes the urgency of mutual understanding among people of faith. For those of you who can go to Zaytuna and sit at the feet of Hamza and Imam Zaid, I highly recommend you avail yourselves of the opportunity. For those who cannot, we are here tonight to avail ourselves of the opportunity of listening to Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And then I will return, and the three of us will sit together and talk. Please welcome Hamza Yusuf.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. Alhamdulillah. First of all, I wanted to just to say to Dr. Bulliet that I felt like I was the opening act was the Beatles, so now I'm really stuck here. So I think the idea of misreading history is a major problem. Misreading any book is always a problem. One of the former professors at Columbia University, Mortimer Adler, actually wrote a book called How to Read a Book. And it's actually worth reading. I would get the first edition, which was 1940. It went into several editions, and it was later rewritten with Charles Van Doren, who was the son of another teacher from Columbia that I was actually named after. My father studied and took his degree from Columbia here. So I'm not an alumnus, but I am the son of an alumnus, if that counts for anything here at the university. They'll probably send a donation thing now. I want to recommend for people to read this book because I think it is an important book. And I would not really put it past the West that one day the idea of an Islamo-Christian civilization is quite possible. I said a few minutes ago that I think before the Holocaust, it would have been impossible for there to have been the concept of a Judeo-Christian society in the West. I think it would have been very difficult for people. People tend to forget that it wasn't that long ago when Jewish people couldn't go onto the beaches of the East Coast. There used to be signs, no Jews and no Negroes allowed. So things have changed. And that should give us hope that there is possibility of change. There's a lot of talk about change going on lately in the air, but the truth is that things do change. Things change for the worse, and things change for the better. And that's part of the nature of just being in the world. Even as you grow older, I think you find certain things change for the worse, like your body, but your mind actually reaches its peak at 49, according to Aristotle. So for the young people in the audience, you have something to look forward to. If the lessons aren't making any sense right now, you might want to review those notes in about 25 years when you've got enough gray cells to actually work out what the hell the professor was talking about. But I do think things change. And I think today we're living at a time in which ideas that were the ideas of philosophers 1,000 or 2,000 years ago are actually becoming a currency amongst common people, which is quite stunning. The idea of racialism today is anathema in the United States in public discourse. It's very difficult for anybody. Your career is pretty much ended if you display public racism. Now, there are a lot of racists in the United States of America, and there are a lot of people that are not even aware of their racism. We've had sociological studies where they'll have a black person with a Harvard degree come in, and the white person interviewing them will change their syntax because there's an assumption that they just have to speak in a different way, and those people might consider themselves completely free of any racism. But there are embedded assumptions in worldviews and in the way we look at things. So things do change, and racism is one of the things that we're seeing change in this country. The fact that 70% of the young people in this country in the Democratic elections have been voting for Obama. And I think that's quite extraordinary. It says something about what's happening in our youth. And I think that that's a sign. If California, they say that what happens on the East Coast today happened about 15 years ago on the West Coast. I don't know if that's true, but we're all driving hybrid cars. I don't know if they've gotten out here yet. And we just started the Department of Volunteers, which is quite, I think, an extraordinary achievement by the governor out there who, if you want to know why we elected him, we're hoping that we're going to be mistaken as a foreign country. Over in Europe. So that's one area that has really changed. The people during the Civil War, there were people in this country that justified racism biblically as well as rationally. They used arguments from Aristotle of natural slaves, that there are natural slaves in the world. Many of those people were actually religious people, Christian and Jewish leaders that argued that it was biblical, that there was a biblical basis. The South was a very Christian part of the country. In fact, the Confederacy could have been seen really as almost a fundamentalist army. I mean, these were really devout Christians, and they thought that slavery was a perfectly acceptable, biblically sanctioned way to engage with other people. But that is no longer the case, despite the fact that there's still racism in the South. People do not accept that idea of one person owning another person. So I think we have to be aware of that. That's quite extraordinary. Now, in terms of the misreading of history, I think, first of all, you have to read history before you can misread it. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people do not know anything about the past. The past, for many people, is taken from Hollywood films. They know more about, I think, British history from films like Braveheart than they do from anything they heard in a history class. And Braveheart has nothing to do with British history for people that know anything about William Wallace or what actually happened, other that there was a guy named William Wallace who did fight somebody named Edward, the second in British history. But this is something that many people in this country are not aware of, not only our own history. And a good example of that is somebody like Ron Paul, who's seen as a kind of wacko candidate, and yet much of what he articulates is very consonant with Founding Fathers' early beliefs. So it shows you how far the country has come in terms of the Founding Fathers and, for instance, foreign policies, no foreign entanglements. That was definitely part of American foreign policy for a long time. Americans did not want to get involved in other places. There was massive resistance to even getting into World War I and World War II. There was actually a very strong America First movement in this country. One of the spokespersons for that movement was Charles Lindbergh, who flew across the Atlantic. So there was an isolationist attitude in the United States. Americans did not like to get involved in foreign entanglements, despite the fact that there is a history, especially during McKinley and after that, there is a history of imperialistic interventions in places like the Philippines. But generally, there was resistance to that. Certainly, Mark Twain, if anybody's ever read his article about the Philippines and the massacre of the Filipinos, he was part of the anti-imperialist movement in this country and very well respected, as people know. One of his statements about which I think related to the Philippines, is that naked people have no rights in this world, meaning Aboriginal people. And he has his own racist remarks and things like that in his statements. But he was acting as an American. He's quintessentially American in his anti-imperialist attitudes. So the problem with this country and the way that we misread history, I think, is that we do have this master narrative. The Americans tend to see themselves as wearing white hats. In many ways, we are the Manichaeans. We are the people that really see things in terms of black and white. It's very difficult for us to perceive ourselves as the bad guy because it just doesn't go with the narrative that we were raised with. That was a view of that Americans had. Manifest destiny. God is with us. The cavalry charged and the Indians all fell. The cavalry charged and the Indians all died. But the country was young then, with God on our side. And this is a view that has been carried into the Middle East. This is a view that has been carried into Afghanistan and many other places. So it's hard for us to see that we have good intentions. And this is an argument that you hear, well, we have good intentions. So we're not really there about the oil. We're there to bring them democracy. Well, there's a lot of other countries in the world that don't have democracy that would have been a lot easier to bring democracy to as just sample case studies, just to show that we could do it. Like, for instance, Mali. Mali would give you no resistance at all. I've been to Mali. I guarantee you the Malians would love for the Americans to invade the country and build their infrastructure, drill wells for them so that they'd actually have potable water and their children didn't die from dysentery. Because I was just in West Africa and I was in a village there where the children are urinating blood because of the grit in the water. And so I'd like to see us bring just wells to Mauritania. Just wells, not democracy, just wells so that they can drink pure water. That's all. Because we spend billions watering our lawns. And that water's potable. Billions watering lawns, but we've got people dying from a lack of potable water all over the world. So these are the realities of our time. We like to see ourselves both in the past and in the present as sometimes very different from how we're viewed by others. And so it becomes very important to listen to the others so that perhaps you can hear something, because Imam Shafi'i, one of the great scholars of Islam, who was noted for his impeccable character, was once asked how he got such good character. He said, I listened to my critics and I took their criticism seriously. It can be very, very therapeutic to listen to what people who don't like you have to say. It can actually help you see yourself. One of the extraordinary things about the Greeks, and the Trojan War was mentioned, if you look at Homer, Homer's anything but Manichaean, because although he's a Greek writing this sacred history of the Trojan War, I tend to side with the view that he actually really has a soft spot for the Trojans. I think he really sees them as actually having more virtue than a lot of these Greek Achaean leaders in that war. And yet he was a Greek. And that's why the Iliad is anything but melodramatic. Because the Greeks were not melodramatic. Great literature and great poetry is never melodramatic. It can't be, or it wouldn't be great literature or great poetry. So when you read poetry, and this is one of the beauties for me of the tradition of Islam, is that it demands of you, before you can actually interpret the Quran, you have to master Jahili poetry. Because it's poetry that gives us the nuances of life. It's only through the poet's vision of the world that we can actually get a sense of the ambiguities of the world. And this is something that's often very difficult for people to recognize, that the world is an ambiguous place. It is often very easy to misread the world. It's very often easy to see ourselves as we are not rather than as we are. And it's always easy to see ourselves in the best light. Always. That's the easiest way to go down. So in reading history, I think the first and most important aspect is obviously to get the right books, because often if it's miswritten, we fall into great error. And these lies and distortions of history have been repeated so often that they do become like truths. For instance, that the Alexandrian library was burnt by the Muslims. I even had a professor, even though I proved to him that it was not, and this was a professor of religious studies, I proved to him that it was not the case, he still told me, well, I like my version better. I mean, quite literally. And this is like Galileo makes fun of a group of churchmen where he shows them that the central nervous system was located in the brain and not the heart. And he shows them, and they remark that it's very interesting what you've demonstrated, and had not Aristotle said that it was centered in the heart, we'd have to agree with you. So this is one of the tragedies, that we have authorities that become like Moses bringing tablets in stone. If Bernard Lewis said it, it must be true, because he is the doyen of Middle Eastern studies. Nobody knows Middle Eastern studies better than he's fluent in Turkish and Arabic and Persian. And what do you say, O great master? O wise one, grand poobah of all who know of the Middle East, tell us what you see with your vast wisdom. Islam, something's gone wrong. We have to rectify it. The question that I would have as an American living in this country, not even as a Muslim American, as an American, is what went wrong here? What went wrong here? Because when I grew up in this country, I had to get under a wooden desk out of fear of being bombed by the Russians with nuclear bombs, long before Osama bin Laden. Seriously. And this was not an axis of evil that was living in caves that didn't even have email. Because there's no, seriously, there's no, you know, Osama, you've got mail. You know, he's not up there in that cave, you know. This was the Russian war machine. This was a real threat. And we were told, quick, get under your desks. When I was in 3rd grade, I didn't realize that the little wooden desk would not protect me from a nuclear explosion. So why were they doing that to us? What was the purpose of that exercise? Create fear. I inherited from my great-grandmother, Lillian Cummings, who studied rhetoric in high school in Wichita Falls. And in that book, which she studied in 1882 by Alexander Bain, called Rhetoric, there's a section called The Emotions. She was 16 years old when she studied this section. And in that section, it had a couple paragraphs on fear. And it said, politicians will often use fear to deprive citizens of their civil liberties. This is why in a democracy, citizens must be vigilant and always be on guard against the use of fear. Because once a person enters into a state of fear, he's willing to surrender his common sense. Now, why aren't those books taught in our schools anymore? Really, why aren't they taught? Instead, Roosevelt said all we have to fear is fear itself. And we had a president that started orange alerts and red alerts. And are you afraid yet? That was actually a cover of Time magazine. It had the question, are you afraid yet? ? But when I was growing up, we had the Russian threat, and yet I never heard anybody talking about, should we torture Russian spies if we capture them to find out what they were doing? Should we have a Guantanamo Bay for Russian spies? I never heard that. It just wasn't part of America at that time. And that's why for me to be in this country and hear people talking about the torture question, when did it become a question? Because I thought that was a medieval concept that we've thrown off. I thought we transcended that. I thought human dignity, no matter what a person did, they were entitled to be protected in their body. That's what I thought this country was about. So what went wrong here? That's a question that I think Bernard Lewis needs to ask also. If he's going to ask what went wrong over there, which is a valid question, because things aren't so good over there. But are things really that good over here? Because we're rebuilding apparently Iraq and Afghanistan, and we haven't rebuilt New Orleans yet. We haven't rebuilt New Orleans yet, really. So we have to be able to perceive the world through the lens of nuance. We have to recognize that we're not living in a black and white world. There's not pure evil in this world and pure good. Human beings are an admixture of good and evil. It's our nature. All of us, whether you're Muslim, this is one of the extraordinary things about the world is it's so evenly distributed, good and evil. Really, it's quite extraordinary. And intelligence as well, the idea of superiority of races. Intelligence is very evenly distributed across the world. You can take people from the poorest countries in the world and take them as little children and put them in the most developed countries in the world. They learn very quick, they adapt, they learn all the same sciences, everything that people here are learning. They can do it. In fact, you can take a Bedouin, where I lived in Mauritania, you can take a Bedouin and bring him here, and within 2 weeks, he'll know how to turn the switches on, flush the toilet, put the toast into the toaster, pop it out, open the refrigerator, pour the milk out, do the whole thing that all we do. But if you go over to where he lives, you'll die in 2 weeks. Seriously, you'll die. In 2 weeks, you'll be dead. So they can survive here, but we can't survive over there. We've got a lot to learn from the Aboriginal peoples, because we might end up going back to no electricity, and it looks like it's all headed that eventually. Right? The polar ice caps are melting. All the water levels will go up, and all this electricity, you'll have water in the house get up to the level of the sockets, and that's it. Right? Florida, they won't have electricity there. They'll be on those stilted houses like they have in some of the South Asian countries. So we have to learn to look in a more nuanced way. Now, there's one issue that I want to talk about, and I'll close on this, is that we're in a crisis, and I think everybody's aware of that, and the crisis is very deep, and there are no simple answers to this crisis, but we need to go deeper. And I want to use one example. We had a police acquittal, I think. Was it an acquittal? It was acquittal. 3 police officers shot somebody quite horribly 50 times. I mean, Ahmed Diallo, it was similar situation. But we also have to recognize, and this is something that the Buddhists are probably more adept at doing than most other traditions, we have to be able to get in to the skin of the other. And until we can really do that in some real deep way, we'll never get to any serious solutions. We're going to remain in that black and white, us versus them, police versus civilians, this type of attitude. We're living in a very violent country. We have police officers that are incredibly stressed out. They graduate from these police academies probably with a lot of ideas about what it is to become a policeman, and become very jaded, especially those that are working in these inner cities and things like this. And until we start realizing that we've got people out there with post-traumatic stress syndrome, we have people out there with high levels of depression. In my state, one of the highest rates of suicide is in the highway patrol. This is our social sciences. You know, people are having a hard time out there. And until we start seeing that collectively we need to work together and to really start looking at these things at a much deeper level, we're not going anywhere. In the Muslim world, we have serious problems. We have failed states. We have people that do not have basic rights. We have countries that basically there are no legal systems. They're simply not working. You cannot go to a judge and get recourse to justice in many, many countries in the world today. It creates an immense amount of resentment, an immense amount of instability, but these are the realities of our time. And then we have a system that rewards greed and venality. We have a system of economic injustice that is extraordinarily harmful to the human condition. It not only harms the people at the very bottom of the pyramid, it also harms the pharaoh. And the Quran calls the pharaoh as well as the slave. The Quran commands Moses to go to Pharaoh and speak to him gently, that perhaps he might wake up. And we tend to forget that the oppressor needs help as much as the oppressed does. Socrates said, I would much rather be the one being oppressed than the one oppressing, because the oppressed, his body is being harmed, but the oppressor is destroying his soul. In terms of the Islamo-Christian civilization, I think it's a possibility, and it's going to either be the ballot or the bullet, and I'm counting on the bullet.
Make note, as we're talking of change and what's possible and the Islamo-Christian civilization, that we have, sitting at this stage, on this stage, we have a Methodist, we find out. We have all 3 American-born here. American-born son of 2 different Christian traditions.
Catholic and Orthodox.
Okay.
So they ended up, they call that the Great Schism. So they did divorce.
And they produced one of America's great Islamic scholars.
And I realized the only way I could really get out of the madness of the Catholic Orthodox schism was to become Muslim. So it worked out. I told an Orthodox priest that, he was actually a bishop from Albania, and he was so troubled that I had apostated. And I told him, well, you do know that we've got that little clause there in the Orthodox tradition that as long as you've been baptized, you'll eventually be okay. Unlike the Catholics, where it's just zip.
Well, I wanted to mention that my mom is Christian, the daughter of a minister from Scotland, and my father is Muslim, the son of a Haji from Karbala. And I think that with the three of us up here and the mission that you've set yourself out on, Richard Bulliet, and what you're doing, Hamza, and in my small way, perhaps myself, we are representing possibilities for this nation and possibilities for the future, as are you out there in the room, and we're not so unusual. And I really wanted to say that before we go into greater depth in this discussion, because it's important to note that there are people like us out there, people like us out there. And that's where we're going to see our hope and our future. So I did notice in this talk of speaking, you say it often enough, and it's the truth. There is an American philosopher named Tommy Smothers who said that as well. If you say it often enough, it becomes the truth. So it's not just Bernard Lewis. He's in good company. I wanted to, but I wanted to take a look, just for starters, at the subtitle for this discussion: Misreading History, What Islam and the West Can Learn from Each Other. So I want to go there, but I also want to state my disapproval of the terminologies Islam and the West. Apples and videotapes. They're not parallel constructs. So as we try to get Islamo-Christian in our vocabulary, I'd like to see if we can find a different construct for Islam
Islam
and the West.
yeah, it's a problem, and it's used. Yeah.
So what would you say? I'm going to use a journalist's crutch. What is the most important, the one thing that the West should learn from Islam and that Islam should learn from the West, just for starters? And I hate that question, but it's a journalist's crutch, and I'm going to use it right now.
Well, I don't like the terms either, and I think that no one except people in the West really do like the terms. What they like about the West is that they feel that allows them to ignore the fact that they have faith traditions that they come out of. And they can say, oh, we're post-Christian, we're post-Judaic, we're the secular West without the slightest self-awareness of where they came from and the way in which where they came from influenced things. So the question of what you learn, to me, it seems to me that you study the history of the West through Western eyes, and you study the history of Islam through Western eyes, because we do not have a well-articulated, widely distributed, generally agreed upon history of Islam that has not been generated in response to and in conversation with, and often in kind of abject acquiescence in the views of Western scholars. And I think that one of the things that Islam can learn from the West is the necessity of taking control of the discourse.
So telling the master narrative from their own point of view.
Yeah, but see, I wouldn't. The problem is that the point of view shouldn't be, the West says it's always us against them and we're good and they're bad. The alternative is not to say, no, from a Muslim point of view, it's us against them and we're good and the West is bad. Because you can't mirror that dialogue. Instead, you have to transcend it and say, no, there is a different view in which the issue of some sort of eternal conflict is not central. That's a political changing environment. And the fact of the matter is that for hundreds of years, the Christians in the West did not consider Islam a separate religion.
Right.
They thought Judaism was separate. So schism, it was a heretical form of Christianity.
The Dante, a lot of people miss that nuance of the Divine Comedy in that he places his fictional character of the prophet in the circle of the schismatics, not with the false prophets, but with the schismatics. And Ali is there because he split Islam according to that Shia Sunni split narrative. So it was seen as a schism. It's very interesting.
So for an author like the one that I was talking about, Anthony Pagden, he says Dante got it wrong, inexplicably. Dante didn't understand that it's the West against Islam.
Right.
But the idea
Well, also,
of the West against Islam is actually very recent.
Yeah, and the Eastern Orthodox Christians have always been disenfranchised from even Western Christianity, and very much. I think the letter of the Archbishop of Antioch to the Pope about the comments he made about Islam. He said, "Look, we've been living here with Muslims for centuries, and it's very different from your perspective." And he was just asking that he understood the situation a little deeper than he was presenting it. I would say that the crisis, and you point this out in your book about legitimization and the crisis of legitimization. Legitimacy is a crisis that I don't think is just in the Muslim world. It's happening here as well. It's happening. The whole nation state, the concept of the nation state, is becoming harder and harder to justify in the type of globalized world that we're living in. The corporate hegemonies that are taking place now, and finance and its central role, which is actually superseding politics really in determining what's going on. But there is a crisis of religious authority, and the way the Catholics dealt with that always was with the magisterium. Jewish and Islamic tradition had a very nuanced way of dealing with that through a type of process of, the rabbis and the ulama would have these long discussions about things and kind of finally come to some either a consensus or an acceptable disagreement. Like, your opinion's valid, my opinion's valid, God knows best who's right. And heretical views or views that were too deviant to be accepted within that were identified, and people were told to stay away, and that's how orthodoxy was identified. That's no longer the case. We have Google Islam today. We have mass numbers of Muslims reading primary text, which was never the case. Before you could read a primary text, you had to go through a training that enabled you to access those texts within the hermeneutic framework of that tradition. Now we have sects emerging in the Muslim world that are really new, and one of them is the political Islamic sect. That's a very new narrative, this idea of the Islamic State. That is a completely Western idea that Muslims have internalized and not even realized where it came from. They don't see that it actually is a Western idea and is far closer to Zionism than it is to Islam. The idea of creating an ideological state in which the believers can live free of the impurities of the disbelievers. So I think that what the West has, America to a certain degree, and certainly Europe, has been grappling with and dealing with, is how we create a pluralistic society where religious space is protected and is not a threat to the civil society itself. So religious violence was a crisis that emerged largely in the 17th century in Europe, which led to these solutions of how we deal with religion, because people are religious by nature, but how do we deal with that so that religion is protected and space is protected, and yet it's no longer a violent threat to the well-being of society.
Well, it's certainly...
The Muslim world is grappling with that now, because religious violence is something that's very real now in the Muslim world. And it's been alien, really, in the history of Islam. Like you said, it's far less prevalent in the Muslim world. But I think we have to learn how we can live with a religious space in which people are free to practice their religion as they understand it.
Well, certainly our Constitution guarantees that freedom of practice. It doesn't say anything about separating church and state at all, the First Amendment. It actually says Congress shall not, interfere with, and I'm not quoting it exactly, the free exercise of religion. When did this split start? You had mentioned that a moment ago, because I think it may have a time parallel with this phenomenon that Sheikh Hamza just mentioned.
I think this is where Edward Said was right in associating imperialism. I mean, there's always been an anti-Muslim discourse, and also parallel to
What, in American academia?
No, I mean in Western thought from the time of the beginning of Islam onward. There has been an anti-Muslim discourse, and there have also been individuals, sometimes influential ones, who have been much more understanding.
But was the discourse because it was a different religion, or because it was a power competition?
It was both, but in a sense more because of power. For example, Charlemagne had relations, diplomatic contact with the caliph, and then his great-great-granddaughter actually sent an embassy to the caliph and said, look, you rule in the east and I'm the ruler of Rome. She was the queen of Lotharingia at that point. Said, why don't we just have a permanent peace as long as you want? And the idea of there being peaceful relations was not anathema. It was a matter of whatever the power constellation was at the time. But once you get to the second half of the 18th century, and you get imperialism shifting into high gear with the idea of kind of having state imperialism establishing colonies in areas with large Muslim populations, then you begin to get more of the systematic demeaning of the Muslim tradition. But going back to what Hamza was saying, I was in Malaysia a couple of years ago, and the Sisters in Islam, which is a feminist group there, had a meeting. Yeah, and they had a meeting with a couple of visitors, the Grand Mufti of Bosnia and an imam here from New York City. And they gave wonderful talks, and the women were really appreciated it and so forth. And then after saying how much they enjoyed their discourse, they started asking the tough questions. What can you tell us about child custody? What can you tell us about this? How can you resolve our problems? And then these guys didn't really say anything. And it became clear in conversation and in thinking about it afterwards that the problem was, and the Grand Mufti of Bosnia had said, we had a labor problem in Bosnia, and Sheikh Qaradawi delivered a fatwa. And I wrote him a letter saying, in Bosnia, I'm the Mufti, and you don't write a letter about Bosnia. And here they were, two imams of great reputation, but from other places. Were they going to say something to women in Malaysia and undercut the local imams in Malaysia? Well, now this is a problem. Is this the nation state beginning the system that originated at the end of the wars of religion in Europe? Is this the nation state beginning to impose itself as a model on Islam? Will you have an Islam that differs from place to place or not?
Well, actually, in Islamic tradition, one of the obligations, it's a condition for the mufti to be a resident of the place he gives fatwa. A mufti is not actually supposed to give a fatwa to a place he doesn't live in because he doesn't know the circumstances.
But Muhammad Abdu became your first magazine mufti. He delivered a fatwa dealing with headgear in South Africa.
I'm not a big fan.
But the supposed tos, people don't know what the supposed tos are. There's a beginning of learning, and the internet has helped, and there are a lot of people studying now, and there are even Muslims who are teaching Islamic studies.
The thing is fragmenting, and it's a real crisis, and I don't think people realize the severity of it. It's fragmenting. I mean, I was just in the Middle East, and people, they're having rave parties in in Saudi Arabia. You know, this is globalization. You know, I mean, it's a very different world, and the older people just, they don't know what to do. They're just, you know, there's not even a word in Arabic for rave party yet. You know, so, you know.
Well, one of the appalling possibilities, there are people now who work in development in Dubai and other places in the Gulf who say that over the next 15 years, they expect a transfer of capital of $2 trillion into the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. That is to say, the Gulf countries excluding Iran and Iraq, practically speaking. $2 trillion. You know, at a certain point, does the Gulf become a center of gravity around which the Muslim world begins to rotate? And if so, what kind of a society is being created there?
That's a good,
it is a frightening prospect.
It's a good point, and it is happening. It's becoming a hub. There's an incredible amount of activity there and it's very exciting. People, I mean, you're there and things are happening at an incredibly fast pace, but the disruptions to the society itself are immense, and they haven't yet dealt with that. And that's something Suzanne George talks a lot about, how, you know, fool and his culture are soon parted. That it's very difficult for people outside of Western society to realize how much of Western dysfunctionality is embedded in Western technology, in Western ways of doing things, that it's a complete package. There's an idea in the West, and I think the Iranians really were at the vanguard of this idea, that somehow we could modernize without westernizing. That was a very common motif in a lot of the writing in the 60s and 70s. Not being aware at how much of what's going on here is actually part and parcel of the breakdown of the family, the dysfunctionality with drug use, all of these things, because as life gets faster and faster, people get more and more disoriented and start having a lot of real problems. And that's already, it's happening there. And they don't have the social sciences that we have. That was one of the things I was trying to convince the ministries, start using social sciences, because you have to understand your society, like what's happening. Interview these young people, find out what's going on in their minds. The only people that are doing that are the marketing companies, and Procter & Gamble did a study called the Emerging Arab Consumer, and identified 4 types of Arabs in the Gulf region: the wee-wees, the wee-mees, the me-wees, and the me-mees. And they said that
that sounds very California.
Actually, I think the guy was from California who did it. But they said, you know, the wee-wees were the older ones who were more communitarian. The family and the culture were more important than the individual. And then the we-me's were, the culture was still important, the family, but the individual was starting to emerge. The me-we's, the individuality was more important than the culture, but the culture was still important. But the dominant group that they said that was emerging was the me-me's, and they could care less about the culture. They just wanted Prada and Gucci and, you know,
but
MTV.
The irony is that this is the area that now has something like 15 American universities who have decided to set up, satellite schools of one sort or another, and they're being bribed into doing it. NYU, I think, was offered $50 million simply to enter into conversation. And so you set up a branch of university. So do you address the Mimi problem by talking about your culture, or by bringing in Western educational institutions to bring in a Western culture?
But so if 15 or 30 years later, California comes to what really is, on most maps, the Persian Gulf, but if you're in one of the Arab countries, the Persian part is left off of the geography. Have you noticed that?
Well, sometimes they call it the Arabian Gulf.
The Gulf, yes.
But it really is the Persian Gulf.
So can we predict then what's going to happen?
All the Arabs called it the Persian Gulf long before it was the Arabian Gulf. Yeah.
Well, you know, the National Geographic put out one map that said Arabian Gulf and Persian Gulf both, and the country of Iran boycotted it and collected petitions with tens of thousands of signatures protesting National Geographic. They canceled all National Geographic mailings to Iran, and I was the intermediary in trying to solve this.
And what did you do? How do you solve that?
But the way you solve it is that you call it Persian Gulf, and then you have a footnote. And then in tiny, tiny script, elsewhere on the map you say,
Also known as.
some Arab countries call it the Arabian Gulf. I remember the Iranian ambassador at that time said, could we put the footnote on a different page?
And it's funny how maps become reality, because in the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, all the maps have Palestine as the name. And you go before Israel in 47, all the maps have Palestine. But now Americans don't ever know that there was a country called Palestine, that was actually a place. People here don't know that. Most Americans actually think Israel was always Israel.
I have a friend who said, I was born in Israel in 1946. And I said, you're going to need to take that off your resume. But I have a coin from Palestine, and it says Palestine.
Postage stamps.
And Palestine
And it's
is
in
a British
Hebrew,
name.
but it's
It
in
was-
English,
The Arabs
Arabic,
didn't call it
and
Palestine.
Yeah.
The Arabs didn't call it Palestine. They called it Shem. It was never called Philistine. The Arabs didn't call it Philistine. So even Palestine is a colonial name. But it was given by British they actually wanted the biblical name. That's what it was called in biblical times. And the Philistines are
So
actually...
the Romans called it a biblical.
Yeah, in biblical times, yeah.
But it was a Roman imperialist.
And the Philistines are the bad guys in the Bible.
Yeah. Nothing changes.
Nothing changes.
now both of you.
These are dangerous books. The Bible, the New Old Testament, New Testament, the Gospel, and the Quran. They're dangerous books. They really are. And I don't think people realize how dangerous they are.
But I think you made a very good point when you said that now people are reading the primary text without any introduction. You said Muslims are reading it, but non-Muslims are reading it too and writing absurd commentaries in which they say, well, I read it in the Quran and my interpretation of what it means governs, which is absurd. You say, well, are you familiar with the 14 succeeding centuries of commentary? No, I read it in the Quran. It's as if we've re-entered a sort of a time warp into the earliest elements of Protestantism, where you try and erase the entire history of the Catholic thinking about Jesus and Christianity and go back to some kind of primitive, intuitive reading of the gospel, except that at least the early Protestants usually knew Hebrew.
Well, you articulated perfectly. To me, that is the crisis. That without a hermeneutic to understand these books that's rooted in compassion and in respect for the other, they become Manichaean documents that can really set people apart. And I think Muslims are susceptible to Manichaean readings of the Quran if they're not careful, just as the Christians and the Jews are very susceptible to Manichaean readings of their book. And that's why the Manichaean heresy is a heresy. And it's a heresy in the Islamic tradition as well. The Qadariyya it's the same idea. We have the same heresy. So all three religions share that view that it is a very dangerous way to read these books, but they can be easily read like that. And I would argue that it's easier to read the Quran like that than it is the Old Testament.
Can I ask each of you for a quick definition for our audience, because certainly I know. Manichaean?
Manichaean is, there was a prophet named Mani who preached that there was a single source of good and parallel to it a single source of evil, and they would be eternally at war with one another, and that you should strive in your personal life to perfect your life so you would become pure good. And then you recognize that there is also pure evil, and then it becomes used metaphorically for anything that pits light and dark, good and bad, good and evil.
Unredeemable, pure evil.
That's right. Evil cannot be erased. It can be fought, but it cannot be erased.
Do you have anything to add?
I mean, just that the Zoroastrian tradition, the Magian tradition, is pretty much the same idea that Ahriman is you have the Mazda, Ahura Mazda, and Ahriman, the god of good and the god of evil, and they're locking heads. Whereas in the Quranic and the Abrahamic narrative is that God created evil with the good. So it's seen as coming from the same source, which gives you a metaphysical framework to understand evil, that it has a purpose, that it's something that's inside everyone. It's not something that is outside of yourself. And therefore it becomes, if you understand that in any true sense of that word, it becomes very difficult to objectify evil in the world, unless you take that Manichaean approach to religion, which religions are very susceptible to that at a simplistic reading of religion. The Quran divides the world, if you read it in that gross literal reading, in the mu'minun and the kafirun. But the deeper you go into the Quran's saying, يُخْرِجَ الْحَيَّ مِنَ الْمَيْتِ. He takes the living out of the dead and the dead out of the living. That night is turning into day and day is turning into night. And be careful, these things aren't as fixed as they appear.
But you take the simple-minded reading and you get these distortions that are very violent in some cases. But then you can do exactly the same thing with the Bible, so that you can say, well, nobody would take seriously a verse in the Bible that says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. And yet you had tens of thousands of women burned to the stake by Christians or drowned because of that verse, because there was a belief that witches were irredeemably evil, they were the agents of Satan, and so on. So, you always have to stand up against the simple-minded, black and white interpretation of things that are properly in every faith tradition, more subtly done.
It's increasingly hard to do in our society, where there's more in black and white available to us, both on in newspapers, on the internet, and in a sort of intellectual black and white in the television news. What do we do?
When you demonize it, when you're demonizing the other, and Dr. Bulliet was talking earlier about the slew of zombie films that emerged after 9/11, and in those films, invariably the zombies are slaughtered with impunity by the good guys, and that he was suggesting that unfortunately there are people in this country that look at Muslims as zombies, mindless and malevolent. And so it becomes very easy I'm always amazed that they talk about 4,000 American soldiers have died in Iraq, and never when that is mentioned is let's just have the Lancet report, which is a pretty reputable, it is a reputable journal in England, using the same criteria that they use for Rwanda, and they came up with almost 1 million civilians have been killed in Iraq. But let's just have that, to be on the conservative side, and say it was 500,000. That's a lot of human beings that are just gone from the earth because of a misadventure that was entirely predicated on lies and deception. And people suffer from it. But when you demonize people, it becomes easy for people to read the newspaper about that and eat their breakfast.
Well, one of the things that we often talk about in the war on terror and so forth is called asymmetrical warfare, in which we have a lot of weapons and they don't, but they're winning in the way it's constructed. But the fact of the matter is that asymmetrical warfare would also apply to something like the Iraq War, where Americans were never threatened by Iraq, still to this day. Iraq has never hurt anybody who was not in the American Armed Services or working for an employer employed by the U.S. Government, whereas bombings and attacks of all sorts have affected the Iraqi civilians. We are carrying out what Raymond Aron called total war against Iraq, but we're not having total war as something that we're suffering on our side. And that disequilibrium, this is the reason we don't have an anti-war movement in this country, is that we don't sense that we're at war. But the Iraqis know damn well we're at war, and that asymmetry is very disturbing to the soul of a country, I think.
But there was that same asymmetry with regard to Vietnam. We were not under attack, nor were we threatened by Vietnam. We've heard a lot about the 50,000 Americans who died and not about the millions of Vietnamese. And there was an anti-war movement. There was a conscience
But you had
in
a
this country.
draft. You had a draft.
And you also had Walter Cronkite, nightly news showing some pretty horrific images coming into. That was the first time people had war images. You can see stuff on YouTube, but there's been an almost total. I mean, we're in almost like a Pravda type situation here. I think in some ways our news is becoming more and more like Russian news, and we're even seeing that the scientists have been censored about global warming. NASA scientists and other scientists were actually censored and told what they could and couldn't say. I mean, thank God some of that stuff is coming out, but there has been a lot of censorship. There have been no pictures. They're not allowed to take those pictures of the funeral, the people coming home in the body bags and things like that. So that's part of the problem. And then another aspect of it is, and let's face it, it's the poor people that are dying over there largely. I mean, if you look at even a lot of the names, it's Sanchez, and it's African American, Mexican American, and then poor white communities that are suffering. If you go into the heartland of America in these small towns, those are the people that are losing the people, and they don't have the type of clout that you have.
But there's an irony, is that the American soldier is reasonably well paid now. He comes from she comes from a lower social stratum usually. But it's a good job until you're killed. But one of the things that we don't seem to realize is that, if we ever got into a big war and we had a draft again, we can't afford to pay a good salary to draftees. Because...
Well, actually we could. You just get rid of all the Halliburton and Blackwater contracts and use all that money to pay the soldiers. You'll have more than enough to go around.
Well, I think you're opposed to capitalism.
Well, let me say on behalf of the sons and daughters of Adam here today, thank you, Dr. Bulliet, thank you, Sheikh Hamza, Yusuf, for a tremendous work.